Thank you very much for joining us this evening, everyone, for tonight's webinar series. We're going to be talking about learning difficulties with Ashley, who is our educational psychologist working at Crossroads. As you're aware, Crossroads has been reaching out through various webinar episodes in recent months to share information, to share knowledge, to help you retain learners in your classroom, and then also to help you know when to refer them into a different structure that teaches more skills-based learning and helps children to identify what their difficulties are and how they can best cope with them. So Ashley is our professional joining us this evening, and I'm going to let her start from the beginning. So thank you very much, Ashley. Please ask, please keep the videos off and their mute buttons on throughout the webinar. There will be questions and answers at the end. So yeah, that's how we'll work it. Thanks, Ashley. Take it away.
So good evening, everyone. I'm really happy that you decided to join us. Of course, the whole Zoom interface is an interesting dynamic that allows us to connect more with others. So I think that this is a great opportunity. Tonight, I was asked initially to talk about cognitive assessments. And yeah, that got me thinking a little bit about the whole concept of a cognitive assessment and identifying children who learn differently. And I think the thing with the cognitive assessment is, it can be quite static because it is a very formalized type of assessment. So I wanted to get a little more dynamic into it. I really wanted us to reconsider this whole concept of, children with different learning abilities. So off the bat, I'm actually going to start sharing my screen and my presentation. Tessa, can I just ask you to make me a host again so that I can share my screen?
Sorry, hang on for 2 seconds.
Yes. Yeah, just so that the preparation for this meeting was actually setting up a power and a backup to that power and a backup to that power. So we had to reconnect a few times because load shedding is actually in the forecast for this evening in my area. So there we go. Thank you. So as I was saying, I really wanted to make this a little bit more dynamic than just talking about a cognitive assessment. I actually really wanted to talk about the child behind the assessment. And I've always had this passion for working with children who some would consider a little bit different. And I thought, this whole concept of learning difficulty, yes, it's got a space, but I also want to reconceptualize that idea from learning difficulties to learning different. And I'll tell you why in a little bit. So I think that a lot of you probably work in a classroom in some way, have encountered someone who may have some learning difficulties.
Sorry, Ashley, can I pause you for a second? Sure. On your screen, you've got the visibility of various people down the right-hand side. Can you make that just a single vision, because it's actually blocking out the rest of your images of your presentation?
There you go.
Thank you.
Is that better? Yeah. Okay. So as I was saying, I thought that there's this whole or what I call a need to rethink how or reconceptualize of how we view children, especially those that have what we often refer to as learning difficulties. So, I got to thinking a little bit about my journey at Crossroads. Since I have been here, I have been at Crossroads for quite a long time. It's my 7th year. So, and I really have worked with a lot of children. All kinds of children have come through Crossroads, left Crossroads, and I think, my job is often both the assessment, so and educational, but much more so the emotional and well-being factor that needs to come with it. And sorry, I'm just going to change some settings. Okay. So, I'm sure you've seen some of this one is a very popular cartoon, the one about everybody's a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it's stupid. And I thought, this is really one of the concepts that we take into account when a child comes to Crossroads, or when a child has special or specific needs. And it's the idea that not all children learn in the exact same way. And not everyone is exactly the same. And sometimes someone needs something different, or whatever it may be. So I think that another idea that I was really thinking about is the labels that children often come into school with. And these labels can be as early as grade 1. I sometimes see children who for a long time, or not for a long time, not necessarily, but they often come into the school with these conceptions and ideas of who they are. And often that has kind of happened in a school environment. So they might have the label of, I'm terrible at maths, or I just can't read. And that label can come from something that they heard. It can come from seeing that they're not as good as someone else. And it does often cause a lot of anguish for children. And I think that that's why there's such a need to reconceptualize, okay, yes, you've got a learning difficulty, but that's not the sum total of who you are. It's not just about that. The process involves reconceptualizing that, or the process of being at a school like Crossroads, for me, very much as a psychologist, involves helping the child to reconceptualize themselves as someone who just or who just needs to work differently or learn differently, or who just needs that little bit more, that special touch. Sometimes children even see their brain as the enemy. And I like to call that brain the learning different brain. Yes, there's this whole idea, it's a learning difficulty. I'm not disputing that. But what I do think is that it's something that a person can work with. So it's just that they have to learn differently. Hence the two cartoons of, tearing off the labels and looking at how we are actually accommodating children who are different. I wanted to share this video with you because it really is about the labels that people carry around with them. And I think before we can get into anything about cognitive assessments or about the whole assessment process and the presentation in class, I think it's so important for us to remember that we need to rethink this idea of giving the child. I don't think that we necessarily do it purposefully. Oftentimes it's taken without meaning, but the child having a label. And I think that this video is especially powerful. just to go back to my slide over here. So I really like that idea because, of course, it's natural for us to all have labels that we carry around with us. And even for children, when they come to Crossroads, they've already got things that they, ways that they conceive of themselves, labels that they carry with them. But changing that one label from, or giving them one label of being loved or being accepted or having the help and support that they need, really make the difference between a child who has the resilience to work, to put in the work that they need to put in often, and one who just struggles and is going to always have the conception that they can't. So, moving on, I think that when it comes to a child who is learning different, as I like to call them, there really isn't one size fits all formula. So I think that that's why sometimes it can be really tricky in bigger classrooms. It can be tricky in a school where, you know, a teacher has a lot on their plate. That's why I think the whole idea of inclusive education can be a little bit difficult. It's challenging for sure. And you know, two people in the world who have the exact same needs. And I think one benefit of a smaller school environment is that we can say there is a size that we can offer a lot of people, but there's some other things that we can offer as well. So I think it's the whole this whole thinking of one size can fit many, but not everyone, and that's okay. So there are many people who will fit in your average school environment, who will thrive, but from time to time you'll come across a child who may just need something different. A while back, I was speaking to an adult who has ADHD, and he actually defined himself as attention difference. And I thought, wow, that's a really interesting way to view yourself. You know, here's a person who has come to live with and accept that part of himself that society widely defines as problematic. You know, he can't focus. His attention is a struggle. It's something that he can't really change, but he had to learn how to accept and work with it. It's really a unique aspect of what makes him who he is. And that really got me thinking about, you know, this path of being in a remedial environment, and how all children who we define as having learning difficulties are actually really just learning different. Just like that person who has the ADHD, he's attention different, they learning different. For whatever reason, this is an aspect of what makes these children who they are. Generally, it's something that they can work on, practice, improve, accommodate, or cope with. And yet it often leads them to be stuck in such anguish because there's this conception that something is really significantly wrong with them, when in fact we know in society today that we need all different types of people. We need people to be different from others to a certain degree. And if we all like the color yellow and we all love to eat the same thing and we all look the same, the world would be a very boring place. So I'm not trying to say that there's no such thing as learning difficulties. I'm just trying to say that if we conceive of it as different, as something that just needs a little bit more, not something that is wrong with the person innately, but something that can be worked with and that makes the person unique or is part of the features that make them who they are, like their eye color, like their preferences. I think it would save a lot of children a lot of anguish. At Crossroads, our goal is to give that little bit more, that little thing that maybe they can't get somewhere else because they can get that personalized attention. And when we embrace that shift, both in a remedial environment and in any school environment, there's place for accepting and understanding those differences and reframing the labels that people often carry with them for a very long time. So just to be clear, I'm not saying that there's learning disorders don't exist, but rather that maybe we can see them a little bit differently. We can reconceptualize them. So I know that being a teacher is kudos to those who are here tonight who are teachers, because I don't think that is an easy task by any means. So I always take my hats off to you, because I know that some days in the classroom can really look like that. especially if you've got children with different learning abilities or children who struggle. And I know that some days also feel like this, which is pretty great. So I know that everyone has a calling to work with kids, those that do. So I think my goal moving forward is just to offer a little bit of help, because I think that knowledge is power and it kind of gives you the edge. So just like this video is saying, the more you know, the further you'll go. Okay, so what are some of the indications of learning different children in the classroom? So we would have, these are just some of the more universally known ones. Difficulty telling right from left, reversing letters, words, numbers after first or second grade. So in first and second grade, it can still be quite common. Difficulty recognizing patterns, sorting items by size or shape. Difficulties understanding and following instructions or staying organized. Struggling to remember what was just said or what was just read. Lacking coordination when moving around. Difficulty doing tasks with their hands like writing, cutting or drawing. Not understanding the concept of time. You might find focus can be an area that some children struggle with, and it's not always ADHD, as I'm sure you are getting to know. Behavioral difficulties often really are one of the things that a lot of teachers are encountering, and anxiety, the pandemic of our day is what I call it. So generally speaking, we would define learning disorders, because of course you now know that I don't love that terminology, but we would define them into a few categories. We've got the dyslexia, where people struggle to break words down into their component parts. That will affect your spelling, your writing, your reading. We've got the attention difficulties. Dysgraphia is difficulties that have to do with writing. Dyscalculia, that is having to do with maths, numbers, processing numbers, and so on. Dyspraxia is motor skills, even things like writing or fastening buttons, tying a knot, things like that. You may find some difficulties come from children being on the spectrum or on the autism spectrum. Some difficulties can be caused, or learning difficulties can be caused by anxiety. And of course, you've got the processing, things to do with processing, that can be processing speed or processing information, processing things that you hear. And those are generally the areas that children struggle with, that would lead them to come to a remedial school like Crossroads. Generally speaking, how we would know that one of those are a significant difficulty or what we would traditionally call a learning difficulty is because they're a significant departure from the norm that cannot be rectified without intensive support. So I think that one of the things that really impacts on a classroom environment that I wanted to talk a little bit about before was emotions and feelings, because sometimes these can both lead to difficulties with learning and also impact on those difficulties if you already have them. So just to have a look over here. Emotions have a substantial influence on the cognitive process in humans, including perception, attention, learning, memory, reasoning, and problem solving. Emotion has a particularly strong influence on attention, especially modulating activity of attention, as well as motivating action and behavior. So as I like to say to all the children that I see, actually anyone that I see, is that feelings are way more important than we actually give them credit for, because depending on the child's feeling, they can, of course, struggle with learning. I mean, if they are having, if they generally are having a difficult time at home, this can impact on learning and really can masquerade as a learning difficulty. So I think that this is an important factor that we just need to remember. So I just wanted to go over this a little bit. Just give me a second. So oftentimes the feelings that we see in a classroom, I think that they can be very triggering. And if anyone wants to share on the chat what the feelings that they find in the classroom to be especially triggering, I would love to hear your ideas, because I think that we all have that certain something that triggers us when we're in the classroom environment. You know, I think for me personally, when a child is disrespectful purposefully, I think that can be very triggering when I'm in a classroom. Because, you know, I like thinking to myself, you know, I'm here to try and generally do something fun and engaging that I've worked on for a long time. And, you know, that can be hard. But then I have to remind myself, generally these difficult behaviors are some kind of need, what we call a need that has not been met. So these are some ideas that I came up with, or that I've looked up and researched, that I think may be interesting. So generally, behavior that is oppositional comes from a need to feel safe. And the underlying issue is generally fear. So it's almost like, rather than getting hurt, I'm just going to show my toughest front. I'm going to oppose everything that you say because I don't feel safe and because I am feeling scared. Then you've got the rude ones, the ones that I think that can be very triggering for a lot of teachers. And generally research or like psychological research just said that there's a lot of need for connection for these children and a need for attachment. They may even lack some feelings of emotional safety. So they almost, again, they push against you. Rather than being vulnerable, they'd rather put on this front. I know that there's that saying that says the children who need the most love look for it in the most unlovable ways. And I think that really rings true. You know, you've got the aggressive children. Oftentimes aggression can mask a lot of anxiety, a need for respect. Sometimes the underlying issue can be revenge or fear. And I think that's when we see a child in that way, we can look beyond the behavior to reflect on the need that is below the surface. Disrespectful, that's that need to assert their power, to feel valued. The underlying issue can be fear, the lack of control, guilt feelings that they just don't know what to do with. I always say that, you know, the world is a very big place for a little child. And when I say a little child, I'm not just talking about the little one, I'm talking about a child in general. You know, they come into this environment that is often new to them, and it takes them a while to adjust to school environment. And there's a lot of expectations on them, both at school and at home. You know, I mean, a lot of parents, you know, we as parents do want our children to do well and we want them to succeed. And sometimes that doesn't translate in the way that we want it to. So things like being argumentative, that could be the need to trust yourself more, the need to be seen sometimes. You know, like I have to argue every point because I need you to see me, I need you to acknowledge me. Oftentimes the underlying need is I don't feel powerful, I'm powerless. Teasing, that can be the need for self-confidence, make someone else feel bad because I don't feel so good. And again, not feeling powerful, feeling marginalized, not feeling seen. Passive children, often, I think they need more hope in their lives. They might be feeling hopeless, you know, so they feel that there's nothing that they can do, nothing that they can contribute. So they don't have hope for things to come. Cynical. This was an interesting one when I was looking this up. Cynical people or cynical children often don't have coping skills to deal with the things that they're going through, you know, so they look at the world very negatively because they don't have any other way of seeing the world. So there's often shame or self-hate that's at the basis of that. And unmotivated, I'm sure we've all seen students who are unmotivated during the course of our time, or, you know, even as parents. And, you know, a lot of the research said that there's this need to sense the future, to hope for better, and maybe a feeling of hopelessness. Now, I'm not saying that these are all exclusive and these are the only ones that exist. There's a whole dynamic range of feelings that human beings both have and need to express. So these are just some ideas to see that there is generally an underlying need that needs to be met. Okay, so getting into the nitty-gritty of things. So the value of a psychoeducational assessment. You know, Tess and I were actually talking, and she was saying that there's a little bit of lack of understanding or knowing about the psychoeducational assessment and when to refer for one. So I think that this is definitely becoming more, people are becoming more aware of it, as a lot of schools require full psychoeducational assessment. So what this means, a full psychoeducational or psychoeducational assessment, is an assessment that involves 3 components. You've got the cognitive one, which traditionally would have been your IQ or an IQ test. We have got the educational, which involves your maths, your English, your reading, and then we've got the emotional component, which really just is a way to look into a child's inner world, or just get a glimpse into what they're going through and what they're feeling. I think that as more schools are requiring an assessment to before enrollment, definitely remedial schools, and I know a lot of high schools, it gives teachers, principals, and anyone working with a child the benefit of gaining a snapshot of who the child is. Because as you can see, the psychoeducational assessment is it's not one area. It is multiple areas. It's the cognitive, which is basically the behind the scenes. What's going on in the brain? How does the brain work? The educational, how are they performing in the classroom? What skills have they developed? What skills do they still need? And then, of course, the emotional. That's what ties it all together, a child's emotional world. What in the emotions are impacting on the classroom or even on their cognitive skills. And then, of course, part of the assessment is also looking into the history, taking into account all of the therapies that they may or may not have had. We also look at school reports, for example, and sometimes we'll ask parents and teachers to fill out questionnaires, depending on the child's needs or what the child is referred for the assessment. So the value really is in gaining as much insight as possible into a child, so that any needs and accommodations and interventions that they need can be accommodated. And I think that yes, it's an assessment. So of course, it's never going to give you everything that you need about a child, because an assessment also only takes place over 1 or 2 days. So that's just a snapshot in time. What if they were exhausted on that day? What if they were emotional? What if something happened? But it gives us the best bet of being able to give a child everything that we can in terms of their way forward, if that makes sense, where they need to go and so on. So when to refer for a psychoeducational assessment, I think it's always good when there's a transition. For example, before a child enters a new school, we do assessments on all of our grade 7s as they go into high school, so that the high school can get the benefit of seeing all that snapshot of the child. Just something interesting about an assessment, specifically the cognitive one. I think some children have come into Crossroads with an IQ score of 8, and in the past, people would look at this IQ score as very static. Okay, this is your score, it's your score for life. And now, I've assessed children who have come into Crossroads 2 years later, their assessment has, their points go up by 20, 30 points. So sometimes that could be intervention, sometimes it could be just emotional well-being, sometimes it could be just the remediation that they are receiving. So in terms of the psychoeducational assessment, when to refer for one, so we said in times of transition, it's a good idea. When you see any of those difficulties that we noted before, a child is just, they can't keep up with the classroom. They are showing significant departures from the norm of what is expected for their age, which results in someone needing to give them a lot of extra support in order for them to get there, or they're not getting there at all. We need the psychoeducational assessment to determine, what can we do? Where's our best port of action or call to action? What's our best intervention methodology over here? So it really does give value. So just to go quickly over what the psychoeducational assessment is. Okay, you can just give me a second. Okay, so in terms of the cognitive assessment, which is the most widely used assessment to help determine, a child's cognitive skills. And like I said, these over here, what this assesses is just 5 areas. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. But we do need something standardized against which we can measure, something that helps us with our understanding. So The most widely used cognitive assessment is the WISC. If you're a teacher or a therapist, you've probably heard of it, maybe even a parent. And the WISC is a normed assessment which looks at the following 5 areas: verbal comprehension, visual spatial, fluid reasoning, working memory, and processing speed. I'm going to go into all 5 areas a little bit more in the next slides, and just to give a bit of an explanation of what that means and, you know, some of the how this will impact in the classroom environment. Okay. So in terms of the verbal comprehension, this really is the language task, how the brain processes and reasons with language. It requires a child to listen to questions, to reason, and to give answers. It also gives an indication of knowledge that a child has acquired, their long-term memory, the things that they can obviously remember of the knowledge that they've acquired, and then the understanding of verbal information. It also has an impact on logical and abstract reasoning, and also the ability to just express yourself in words. So if you were seeing difficulties in this area, what you might see in the classroom is struggling to infer and reason on a verbal level, struggling to solve abstract problems that involve language or like mathematics, but in terms of word sums and things like that. Maybe struggling with making generalizations, struggling to create solutions to problems, having difficulty transforming and extending a concept, things to do with thinking, learning, expressive communication, understanding vocab and expressing yourself. Also missing cues and nuances in language. I mean, language is not just the words that we speak, it's the tone, it's the facial expressions, it's intonations. Not taking part in classroom discussions is often an indication that this may be an area of difficulty. Not interested in learning new information, not participating. This may often have relevance to children who are on the autism spectrum and may also have, therefore, poor theory of mind, which means the ability to conceptualize that someone else can think in a different way to the way that we do. And of course, social difficulties. They often, children who struggle with this often do struggle socially as well, I find, because they don't really get the nuances in communication. And reasoning can be a little bit of a struggle. So they may really need a lot of assistance and guidelines on how to engage with others. So let's just say you get a cognitive assessment and, you know, this is a child who does not need a remedial school. It's just someone that needs a little bit of extra support in the classroom. So what can you do? Now, I'm going to tell you some of the things that you can do. Keeping in mind, I do understand that you'll have a lot of students in the class, and it's not always possible to provide every single child, depending on the school environment, with all of their needs. So I'm going to talk to this fact towards the end, once I've gone over some of these ideas. So what can you do in the class if you get a child who has a cognitive assessment and says, you know, they struggle with verbal comprehension? So they need a lot of repetition and review of concepts. You know, I think that's one of the premises of the remedial school and environment is a lot of repetition and a lot of breaking down of concepts. So encourage creativity with problem solving. So not just verbal problem solving, make it visual. They need it to be maybe even auditory, music-based, tactile-based, all different kinds of things. So when introducing concept, use familiar vocab, you know, your very easy speech. Encourage discussion. They need to be taught strategies to increase understanding and retention of concepts. So things like self-talk, you know, how do I verbalize this to myself? How do I break it down into steps? Games, just any time of the week, a child is happy to play a game, even if it is something that has to do with learning. They are much more willing to do it in a game format. So, you know, games are my secret weapon. And, you know, I know not everything can be a game, but if it was up to children, I think that's how they would have it. You may want to provide them with the important vocab so that they can learn it. They need to review questions and then look for answers. And then, oh, there's my games again. The next area that we look at in terms of the in terms of the cognitive assessment is what we call visual spatial. So this is how the children make sense of what they see in the external world, how they visualize pictures and images in their mind, and how well they can build or construct something by copying a model or following instructions. Now, as you can see, this doesn't directly translate into, let's just say, maths, English, geography. These are the underlying skills that have to come together for maths, English, geography, and so on to take place or to be successful in those areas. The visual spatial index also looks at how a child can break down an object into its component parts and how those things are positioned in opposition to each other and so on. So it's also puzzles, it's putting things together. It is both direct and inferential thinking. So where you might, if you see a child with these kind of difficulties, this is what you might see in the classroom. They struggle to copy information from the board. They struggle to interpret data from graphs, charts, maps, flow diagrams. They might struggle with aspects of maths like geometry, calculus, mathematical reasoning. They also reading may be a little bit difficult, processing and understanding what is seen on the page. I think reading is such a complex task because it involves so many elements in the brain having to come together, from seeing it to understanding it to making sense of symbols. It's a really higher order task that children have to learn to accomplish. Remembering letter formation and patterns, so you can see it might impact on writing skills. They may struggle to understand how work is arranged on a page. Or you may find that children who struggle in this area, really, their organizational skills are very poor. It takes them a lot of time to read information, and they struggle with social cues, the facial expressions, body movements, understanding when someone wants some space. They may really struggle with that aspect. So if you do come across an assessment or cognitive assessment that has a child who has poor visual spatial skills, these are some of the things that you can do to help accommodate them. Teach child strategies to interpret visual information. Again, it's the breaking down into steps. Organizational skills, they can be taught. So teach them the organizational skills. How do we organize the things around us? Intervention for social skills. I mean, one of the things that, or one of the main components of my job as a psychologist at Crossroads is teaching social skills. I have to say it's teaching, because it is just something that doesn't come naturally to all children. And social skills, as much as some of us take it for granted, some people have, or some children really struggle with this, understanding others. Teaching them to keep their workspace free of materials, helping them to clear their desks, make their desks a place where they can, or they know where everything should be and everything that's expected. One that's really helpful is providing fewer questions on the page. So instead of having your 20 questions on the page, put, let's just say 10 or 5 with a lot of space in between. It really stimulates the brain to understanding. Allow them to give written rather than drawn answers, or they can, sometimes they might do well verbally and then they can explain it. And so on. Okay, the next area that we look at is called fluid reasoning. And this is an interesting one because it's really about how a person can interpret or solve problems that they've never encountered before. So it really is about thinking about something or taking information that you know and applying it to things that you may never have encountered. It might be examining the given information to understand what type of problem needs to be solved, understanding patterns of information to make sense of the underlying meaning, drawing on previous learning and experiences to develop new ways to solve unfamiliar problems. So if a child were struggling with fluid reasoning, where you might see this in the classroom is understanding, recognizing, and forming concepts, perceiving relationships among patterns, drawing inferences from information presented, understanding implications of an issue or an action. So you may see that they don't really understand the consequences of their behavior, not knowing how to use logic, not knowing how to solve problems that they've never encountered or that are unfamiliar, even though they know how to do it. But if it's unfamiliar or presented in a new way, there's a bit of a breakdown. Understanding concepts using language, and then using quantitative reasoning. So, for example, computer and mathematical concepts. One example that I can think of is comparing how two things may weigh the same or not. So what you can do in your classroom is, of course, it's always about providing verbal instructions rather than charts or diagrams. I think what we'll see at the end is something that can bring a lot of this together. So encouraging the child to write down the list of procedures or steps. Verbalization and verbal mediation can be helpful if their verbal skills are strong. Encourage using verbal memory skills to teach problem solving. So they need to repeat, and sometimes they also need to rote learn it. Present new concepts both verbally and visually so that they get a view of both. Teach problem solving skills that are what I call systematic, verbal, and step-by-step. Teach problem-solving strategies in the context that they will be applied. So show them how to apply it in this new environment, and then teach verbal strategies to help with organization and written work. Okay, we've only got 2 more areas to look at. The one being the working memory. Working memory is a very special interest of ours at Crossroads, because we are finding that so many of the children who were coming through to Crossroads, this was an area of struggle. I would say up to 80%. And what working memory is it's the ability to hold information in the short-term memory and to manipulate it in some way. So, for example, would be performing mental arithmetic. If you said to a child, how much is 2 plus 2? So there's a lot of cognitive processes that are going on. Firstly, they need to remember what you just said. They need to recall the instruction. Then they have to go into their long-term memory and say, okay, what do I do with this? Oh, I plus this. What does that mean? Okay, this is what that means. And so this is also about retrieving your long-term memory. It measures skills and attention, because if you're not paying attention, you definitely are not going to be able to remember. Concentration and mental reasoning. And it's very closely related to a child's learning and achievement, because I suppose, unfortunately, a lot of education really is memory. I mean, when a child goes into an exam, oftentimes it really is about learning and remembering the information that they learned. Thank goodness, I think we're also going more towards application in today's educational landscape. But I mean, there's still a very big memory component, so it's still essential for school. So you may find children with working memory difficulties struggle to keep up with the pace of the class. They struggle to self-monitor and focus because, or sometimes the focus causes the memory difficulties. They work very closely together. They really need to rehearse things often, or to encode it in a specific way that works for them. They can't recall instructions. You know, this is the child that you just say an instruction and comes back to you and says, what are we supposed to do? Which sometimes can make you want to pull your hair out, because I'm like, I just said it. Then, of course, they might struggle with remembering visual information, reading and writing. It has an impact, or than writing. Remembering verbal information, and then mathematics, more to do with remembering what to do or learning new concepts. So what do you do for a child who has working memory difficulties? So when given directions, first you need to provide a simple global statement that describes the task. They need a broad overview, and then they need instructions to be short and simple. As a teacher, you can just ask them to rephrase it. Did you understand it? Can you tell me what needs to be done? They may benefit from compensatory aids, like writing down directions, or having a breakdown of it, or having different colors sometimes works really well for some reason. They need lots of repetition. Memory strategies, things like chunking, verbal rehearsal, visual imagery, those are very helpful for children with working memory difficulties. And then they need to connect visual information with verbal techniques like mnemonics, word chunking, things like that. And then if all else fails, you can send them to Crossroads for cognitive training. We do a working memory training, and we are a cognitive school. I'm sure you may have heard about that. And we have seen amazing results in up to, I would say, 80% of the children who have done this cognitive training. So I think that's absolutely wonderful. So the final area that we look at in terms of the cognitive assessment is processing speed. And that's basically how fast and accurately a child can complete simple tasks that involve, like, let's just say, looking at small shapes or looking through information and then writing down the correct response. So one example I can think of in the classroom is copying from the board, because it involves taking in information visually, manipulating it in some way in your brain, and then outputting it generally in a motor output. So children who struggle with processing speed, these are the children who get overwhelmed very easily. So I think that that's important to know. When they see a lot of information, their brain says, no, thank you. And generally they often opt out because it's just too overwhelming. They may struggle with developing the authenticity and foundational reading and math skills. So it really is hard for them to just, it doesn't come naturally. You may find that their performance is slow on basic math sums, times tables. They often have to use their fingers to count beyond the age where it's normal. They take a lot longer than their peers to complete assignments. I mean, we're talking significantly longer over here, and it's generally not caused by, let's just say, the need to be a perfectionist. They don't finish tests or exams within the allotted time. They read very slowly. They come to the right answer, but it takes them a really long time. You know, on a more personal level, you may find that these are the children who you will say something to them and they will take that information, take it away with them, take a little bit of time to process it, and a few days later try and bring it up or remember it. What you can do in your classroom for children with processing speed difficulties, obviously we accommodate processing speed. That's why in matric exams, additional time is one of the elements that a person would apply to. So, you know, they may, you would allow the child more time to respond to questions and make decisions, and maybe even for assignments. As long as it doesn't bring negative attention to them, of course, we never want that to be the case. Give them very simple directions, speak slowly. It takes them a bit of time to process oral directions. Reduce the quantity of work in favor of quality work. Allow extra time to proofread work. Give extra time for tests and exams. Provide notes rather than asking the child to copy them. Teach the child how to monitor time, because sometimes they also lack time awareness. Practice timed activities, you know, things like flashcards or so on. You know, sometimes processing speed, a child can grow out of it, but sometimes it really is just about accommodating it. Okay, so I know that is really a lot. And I also want to leave a little bit of time for questions, but just before we do it, this is just a few minutes. I just want to watch this video because I know that in a big school environment, in a classroom where you might have 20 or 25 children, you're not going to be able to accommodate every need that every child has. So what can you do? I think this video can really help us with that.
I like to learn by doing myself.
Very hands-on.
Hands-on learner.
Hands-on.
So like if I have a model, I'd like to look at that and look it over.
Part of this video was sponsored by Google Search. There is this idea in education that everyone has their own preferred way of learning, their so-called learning style. If information is presented in accordance with the learning style, well, then they'll learn better. Now, there are dozens of different learning style theories, but the most common one identifies 4 main learning styles: visual, auditory, reading, writing, and kinesthetic, or VARK for short. Visual learners learn best from images, demonstrations, and pictures.
People may say things, but I can't really take it in. I just gotta see them act it out or write it or something.
Auditory learners learn best from listening to an explanation.
Like in school, I was always engaged in the lecture, and that was usually good enough to pass a test.
Reading, writing learners learn best from reading and writing.
Like I can get pretty much anything out of reading a textbook or something.
And kinesthetic learners learn best by
So
doing,
I'm just going to
physically
stop
interacting with the
there,
world.
because I want to
Hands-on.
move forward. This is a 14-minute video, but just to give a brief explanation of this is a little bit of this would really be difficult if we had to accommodate every person's different learning needs and styles. So this person went and together with Google, they did research and they found that there's a little bit of inaccuracy in that. People prefer to learn in certain ways, for example, visually, but that doesn't mean that, for example, someone who prefers to learn visually will learn in the best way by learning visually. So they did a whole bunch of research. They took a whole bunch of people. For some people, they learned according to what they thought their learning style was. And for some people, they presented with a multi-integrated learning style, and they compared the results. And there was no difference when someone was taught in their specific learning style to when they taught in an integrated learning approach. So I'm going to jump over to kind of, I think, what I would call the results of the test.
Don't improve learning, then what does? Well, there's a large body of literature that supports the claim that everyone learns better with multimodal approaches, where words and pictures are presented together rather than either words or pictures alone.
Now there's going to be words as well as the picture. We're going to see if this is any better.
This is known as the multimedia effect, and it explains, in part at least, why videos can be such powerful tools for learning, when the narration complements the visuals.
Duck. Heart. In my PhD research, I found explicit discussion of misconceptions was essential in multimedia teaching for introductory physics.
How many is that?
6.
6. Okay, that's good.
That is a whole 50% better. Do you think that was easier?
Yeah, with the words, yeah.
100%.
Sure.
Ultimately, the most important thing for learning is not the way the information is presented, but what is happening inside the learner's head. People learn best when they're actively thinking about the material, solving problems, or imagining what happens if different variables change. I talked about how and why we learn best in my video, The
It's a really
Science
nice
of...
video if you want to watch the whole video. I think it's very beneficial. But I think just to summarize, basically, if you can't accommodate every single one of the learner's needs, then a multi-integrated approach where you're learning, where you're using words and videos and images and involving children in their own learning is the best option for probably 90% of learners. Okay. Just as the last point I want to just talk about is, so when does a child need to be referred to an environment like a remedial school or Crossroads? So I think that, that's what the cognitive assessment lets us know. Is this something that can be accommodated in the average classroom, or is this something that really needs more? So in a Crossroads school environment, we're able to not just do the one approach to learning, we can give every single child all of their needs being met. That's the point. That's why we keep it small. That's why it's about repetition. It's about integration. It's about accommodating learner styles, and it's about looking at all the aspects that a cognitive assessment looks at and giving that child the intervention that they need, both in the classroom and in terms of therapy. So I suppose the time when in a different school placement is indicated is when a child is just not coping in the mainstream school environment and they cannot be accommodated. So that's a good time to refer for an assessment. And that can help you determine, is this something that we can intervene on, for example, within this normal school environment, or do we need a little bit more? And sometimes it's okay. Sometimes we just need to be okay with the fact that some people just do need that little bit more. They are learning different, just like all of us. And that's the point. It's accommodating them. So with that, I'm going to stop talking. I'm also going to stop sharing my screen. And if there's any questions, I would like to hear it. Any experiences as well in your classroom. I think that's always, it's nice to hear and so on.
Thank you very much, Ashley. I think that was a most informative session. And I think the point that you made about the labels up front is a very, very important one, because that translates into everything we do. And whether we're talking about different ways of learning, whether we're talking about diversity, whether we're talking about transformation, we talk about all of those things, bullying, children feeling less than, differently, the words we use, the language we use, it's all interrelated. And I think society needs a bit of a wake-up call. I think humanity needs a bit of a wake-up call. I said to someone earlier today, I said, humanity needs a check-in. We need a check-in of actually what we're doing. Because I think there's so many things that we do that cause so much damage and not aware of it. So thank you very much for picking up on that and sharing that with us. We have got a comment from someone in the chat.
Yes.
She says, I have a child in my class, grade 3, who can't read or write words. She constructs words with random letters at random stages. The mother can't afford to get her a full educational assessment that is needed to refer her to a school to help her. The Department of Education is yet to follow up on the request for help. How can I best support her in the day-to-day classroom until something changes?
Okay. Yeah, so I did actually read that. A few things I just want to comment on. There are a number of organizations that I know offer education assessments. I know it takes long. That just is, you know, the bureaucracy that we have to deal with. WITS has a assessment center in which they, you know, she can go onto the waiting list. I think FAMSA does. I know a lot of interns who need to do assessments. So perhaps asking on groups on Facebook can be helpful, or around teacher groups, because there are generally people who can help with that. And I know the Department of Education can take forever. So yes, I really feel for these littlies that struggle. And I also feel for the teachers, because here you are sitting with a child who really needs a lot of support and attention and that love label, you know. So how you can support her, it's a complex question, because I don't know a lot of her history. I don't know enough to tell you, but what generally works is definitely a lot of repetition. She's going to need individual attention, because there's a reason she's not able to focus in the classroom environment, or she's not gaining from the classroom environment. So sorry, I just saw another question come in, so I got distracted. So she, so to accommodate repetition of instructions, she needs to go over those things a lot. You know, I've got a friend who heads up a massive endeavor in Ireland where they work with children with dyslexia. And I was like, okay, so what can be done? What you would expect, it's repetition, it's going over it, it's looking at different modes of learning. Sometimes some children may need like a sensory approach. So for example, if she's not knowing her letters and her sounds, do it differently. Learn with Play-Doh, let her listen to it. Those are just some ideas that I have offhand. You know, you can reach out to me if you would like to. I think I do have more to say on the topic that is beyond the scope of this, but you know, if you pop me an email, I'm happy to answer that. Tessa, can I just go through the other questions?
Yeah, go for it. I have answered one of them about Crossroads taking children on the spectrum. If you can go to the next one of I'm a teacher of the deaf.
Okay, can we use IQ tests of them? Okay, so just for everyone's knowledge, someone asked, can Crossroads accommodate children on the spectrum? How functioning? How big are the classes? Just in terms of children on the spectrum, definitely, especially those who are high functioning. We have a lot of children on the spectrum. They are wonderful little contributors to our Crossroads environment. They make life very interesting for us, and they actually really love the Crossroads school environment. I've worked at a few schools. I've been doing this. I've been in the education setting for 10 years, and I've yet to see a school that is as accepting. And I'm not trying to advertise Crossroads here. I just think it's quite an amazing thing that you can have such a diverse variance of people in a classroom, and that other people will accept them. And I see it as they get older, it's actually better, because the younger ones still struggle a little bit with self-regulation, so it can be hard. So yes, Okay, I'm a teacher of the deaf. Can we use IQ tests for them? Can you recommend any? All of the behavior. So the thing with IQ tests, like I said, it's really one aspect of, or it's measuring 5 aspects of intelligence. I was reading an article that says that today we've got 20 or 30 different types of intelligence that we recognize. So I suppose the benefit is in terms of just having a formalized assessment. I don't know all of the information about which assessments are used and which IQ assessments are used. To be honest, I've never done that before because a lot of it is verbal based. So I think it would be good to get in touch with more specialized learning environments. It's not something that I know enough about. But again, it's something that I can look up and perhaps potentially talk about in the future. I don't want to give you an answer that isn't 100% right. And yeah, I think that's about it.
So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us this evening. I am going to stop recording now.